All right, Ian. We have a Patreon poll. How do you access the Patreon?
Patreon.com/CU podcast. You go, you pay, you get the full video podcast.
Oh, yes. Late on Tuesday night. Pat's slaving away.
Full video podcast. You get a writing about once a week. I just did my favorite games of 2020. I do a hangout once a month, and you can vote in this poll. Poll topic polls. Polls.
This was the closest three-way race I think we have ever had on the podcast before. This is strong to me. That makes me feel like we were in the right direction here. So in 28% in third place is extremely strong. What do you miss most about gaming conventions? 28%. In second place, what sitcom would make a good video game? 36%. And in first place, by a single vote, I had to download the Excel spreadsheet to verify. Is retro the proper term for older games, or should it be classic? Ian, what do you think about this?
I was going to let you go first.
Damn it. Okay.
Hey, you said this was the one you wanted to win, so I figured you had a spiel ready.
I don't have a spiel ready, but I'll look up. Oh, okay.
Okay. So it's okay. Then go. Well, you're the one looking up. I can start talking. If you have to look it up, I can start talking.
Okay, go Ian. You go. I was looking up the definition. Go.
So I think retro is, despite the fact that it's probably the most widely used term, I don't think it's necessarily the most appropriate term. And that goes down to definition, which we said when we were talking yesterday, it was going to have to come down to definition. The definition for retro is imitative of a style, fashion, or design from the recent past. So
sure.
Retro, I think, by definition, would mean things that are attempting to be from an era, not actually being from the era. So retro styled gaming, when it's used in terms of indie games, modern indie games that use an 8-bit aesthetic or a 16-bit aesthetic, that use, our single screen platformers, are very difficult, that sort of thing. That, I think, it's a retro styled game. But actual gaming, I think you have to go with classic gaming, because definition-wise, it harkens back to an earlier era. What's your thought?
Well, classic doesn't necessarily mean that either, though, when you look at the actual definition. Judged over a period of time to be of the highest quality and outstanding of its kind, remarkably and instructively typical. That's how people usually use classic. Oh, it's the classic design that we were used to. Doesn't necessarily mean older. Well, doesn't necessarily mean it. It can be older. Doesn't necessarily mean it, though.
And you also think classic movies. Classic movies does not imply that all old movies are classic movies.
No. It was a classic. It came out in the 90s or 2000s. It doesn't mean...
Sure.
Back to the Future is considered a classic movie, and it's from, well, even that was a classic even 20 years ago. Like that. So like it's a tougher term, classic. Here's the cool thing about language, though. It evolves how people use it.
Yes.
Especially English. English is very adaptive to how people use it. So when I got into retro gaming, it wasn't a term yet. It was just older shit that I was into. I was into Atari games even in the early 90s for some weird reason. I tried to buy my neighbor Billy's Atari 2600 games.
I bought a 5200 at a flea market in like 92 because I liked playing my grandparents.
While we were playing NHL, or at least we were playing Genesis, I wanted to go and play Atari games. I swear to God, when I was like 10.
No, I believe it.
I don't know why. I wanted to play Keystone Capers, and I don't know why. That's where I got the bug. I was that young. I was like, I want to do something simpler before my time, kind of. Well, at least when I was barely walking, Keystone Capers came out. I don't know. When I came out, 81, 82. But then I got older, and then for some reason wanted to take a Master System because I was insane when I was 11. And then when I got to the mid-90s, I had regretted selling my NES games a few years before at a garage sale. I ended up selling them probably when I was like 13 or 12. And then I wanted to go back and rediscover these games. So even by the mid-90s, now it's retro gaming, right? Now it's like, okay, I'm going to go in TSR's NES archive. It's not really retro yet then because people are still playing NES games in the mid to late 90s, but we're getting closer. I don't know when I first heard the term retro gaming. I cannot tell you the first time. Because even when I was going to digital press, like 20 years ago, digital press, what was digital press? What's on the sign? It's not retro gaming store. It's just video games, right? Digital press video games. It's literally what it's called. They use one word video games because Joe Santulli's from the old guard, which I don't agree with. That's all the conversation. Video games is 2 words.
It's 2 words.
Not 1. That's weird. But it's just literally digital press video games. Buy, sell, trade. They use classic games, current games. That's what they use. They never use retro. So I don't know where the term came from. I'm being perfectly honest. I don't know where it came from.
I think it probably, I think it just was co-opted by advertising and marketing. Around 2000, I think, was when I started to see, I had a Pac-Man shirt in high school that was not, a Pac-Man shirt from the 80s. So people started to see, just like they did with the 70s, that you could milk nostalgia, with fashion, with tchotchkes, with t-shirts and all that. But I think I really started to see like the keep it old school, shirts and stuff pop up at Hot Topics around like 2000 or so. And I think that's when the word retro started to make its way into the lexicon. But old school gaming, retro gaming, classic gaming, you're right. Classic gaming, I feel like, actually deserves to be bandied around the least because it's a very specific definition. The only problem is I'm trying to think of a term that accurately would reflect, say, the late 70s era of gaming or the 80s era of gaming without saying 80s gaming, because things like retro gaming and old school gaming, even, those are constantly updated with every year that passes.
Update.
With every year that passes,
Yes.
a new generation becomes old school or retro gaming.
We never adopted the comics things of like platinum, gold, silver, bronze.
Which I think would work.
I guess you could say like platinum would have been like everything up to like Pong. You could have said that,
Sure,
or something, and then gold would have been up to NES. We'll just say silver. Yeah, we never did that because eventually you run out of colors. At that point.
True. I mean, that doesn't work well either.
Because comics goes back to the 30s, and the platinum was pre-comics, which is like up to the teens, I think, late teens for like zines and stuff. So like we're talking like almost 100 years of video games. Home console gaming is not 50 years old yet. It's gonna be 50 years old next year. So we're still like, it's still way younger. It's the youngest medium. Here. Wikipedia has a retro gaming article. One word, which I don't like either. Retro gaming, also known
retro gaming is one word?
On Wikipedia. What?
Retro gaming?
It doesn't make any sense.
No,
retro gaming. Also known as classic gaming and old school gaming. I've never heard the term old school gaming in my life.
I have heard the term. I said,
not.
I mean, you've had to have seen the shirts "Keep It Old School." I think that's where it comes from.
Yes, but I've never used it as terms to describe a game store or a hobby. I've never heard of it. Okay. It is the playing and or collecting of older versions of personal computers, consoles, and or video games, generally arcade. I'm not sure why it says generally arcade. That's not true. Wikipedia. In contemporary times. Usually retro gaming is based upon systems that are obsolete or discontinued.
That is true.
It is typically put into practice for the purpose of nostalgia, preservation, or the need to achieve authenticity. That's not a bad definition. I don't agree with it 100%, but that gets there.
That's pretty good.
I don't think it's... I think, how about just playing an older game before my time, though? Typically, it implies that that's most of the time when it's not. Retro gaming has 3 main activities. Vintage retro gaming. Vintage gaming.
Vintage gaming.
Vintage gaming.
That's the term.
That's the term we're seeing. Vintage is...
and that is a term I've heard before. It's just escaped me, this
That's
discussion.
probably, in terms of Merriam-Webster definition, without looking at vintage is closer than classic and retro.
Yes.
Because vintage is old, not made to look old, not a feel. Vintage is old.
Vintage is also used in terms of like fashion to clearly denote that it's actually from that time period. So yes, vintage would be proper.
Yes, vintage is the proper term. It was never vintage. So, okay. Retro gaming has 3 main activities. Vintage retro gaming. Never heard that. Retro gaming emulation and ported retro gaming. Who's writing this article? Vintage retro gaming includes games that are played on the original hardware. Emulation involves newer systems simulating old gaming systems, while ported retro gaming allow games to be played on modern hardware.
It'd be like people going through all the arcade archive stuff on the Switch or something.
I never heard divided like that, but I guess it makes sense.
No, it does make sense. I've never heard it that way either.
Additionally, the term could apply to a newer game, but with features similar to those older games, such as a retro RPG. Okay, vintage gaming is what it should be called. But then the point remains, when do you cut off vintage? Because that even applies to vintage toys.
Sure.
Because that's probably, now I think about it, vintage toys. You never hear vintage comic books though, because it's age. But vintage toys, vintage collectibles, you do hear that term. It's for like a previous generation, basically. It's
Right.
vintage versus modern.
And I think that becomes an entirely different topic.
Vintage Star Wars toys versus modern. When do you cut off? Is it the 90s Power of the Force line in the mid 90s? You know, is that now vintage? Like that makes sense though. When I saw vintage, like why couldn't we think of that? Participants in the hobby are sometimes known as retro gamers in the United Kingdom, while the terms classic gamers or old school gamers are more prevalent in the United States. No, they're not. They're not. They're not more prevalent. Who's writing this article? Can I be an expert and edit this? Similarly, the games are known as retro games, classic games, or old school games. Yeah, old school games is not a term. That might be like a term for like 55-year-olds or something. I don't know anyone has heard that term at a convention.
What term?
Old school gamers. Or I have not heard that term. I haven't.
Okay, that's fine.
I'm getting insulted here. Okay, I didn't know this was an article. This might be a newer article here.
Doesn't seem like it's poorly written, honestly. I mean,
I just disagree.
It makes a few good points.
I just disagree with some of this. So what was the topic?
What's the proper term?
It's not retro.
It's not retro or classic. It's vintage.
It's vintage.
It's vintage.
We've solved the puzzle. We didn't think about that. It's really, honestly, it is vintage. But retro,
vintage avoids the pitfalls of the other two.
Yes, vintage definition. I'll just look it up right now. Vintage is adjective relating to or produced in a particular vintage for wine, of old, recognized, and enduring interest, importance, or quality. Of old.
Yes,
that's the thing. Outmoded,
not old styled,
dating from the past.
Yes,
that's the thing. The other ones don't necessarily date from the past. They can reflect upon the past, but not necessarily refer to the past directly. There you go. Is that a CU podcast vocabulary lesson? What is it?
CU vocabulary.
CU vocabulary lesson of the week.
Vocabulary. CU vocabulary. All right.
Are we gonna commission a little animation of us?
It's the States.